For a German soldier raised on absolute loyalty, America was supposed to be a nation of chaos and fear. But Hans Richter found something far more terrifying than a monster when a discarded newspaper revealed citizens openly calling their leader a tyrant. And nobody was arrested. The truck rolled through the darkness, an iron coffin rattling across miles of unknown desert. Inside, Hans Richter braced his body against the sudden lurches and turns, his mind already preparing for the punishment he knew was coming. Captured weeks earlier in the dusty chaos of Tunisia, he was one of many German soldiers being shipped across the Atlantic to the heart of the enemy. The sounds of the journey, the grinding of the wheels, the echoing shouts of American military police fed the same terror he had heard whispered by his officers. America, they had been taught, was a cage of steel and fire, ruled by capitalist barbarians who lived only to destroy honor and profit from misery. He carried the certainty that American victory meant only German ruin. Hans, at 23, was an aspiring intellectual whose loyalty to the Reich had been built on a vast, carefully constructed scaffold of ideological literature. He genuinely believed that the United States was a hollow, decadent machine. The stories were vivid and certain. Captured Germans would be used as slave labor. Their bodies worked until they broke. He expected to be mocked, starved, and subjected to deliberate, cold humiliation. He had spent his entire journey rehearsing the stoic face he would present when he was finally made to dig his own burial place in the red soil. The truck finally slowed, its gears grinding in protest. It was not yet dawn. The vehicle stopped with a final jolting shudder. Hans waited for the inevitable barked commands. When the back door of the truck was thrown open, the silence that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. Standing silhouetted against the growing light was a single American officer, relaxed and unhurried. He held a clipboard, not a weapon. His voice was slow and devoid of any malice. The interpreter translated, "Welcome to Camp Whipple. You will line up a single file. We will have a hot breakfast ready after the roll call." Hans blinked, unable to process the total lack of rage. Breakfast? Hot food? He stared past the officer. The compound looked impossibly organized. There were no visible chains, no snarling canine animals. His comrades exchanged uneasy glances, their fear momentarily paralyzed by the confusion. He followed the others out of the truck. As the daylight brightened, an announcement was made. Due to labor shortages, prisoners were being assigned to work details outside the camp's perimeter. Hans was selected for a detail assisting with municipal maintenance near an army airfield. He still felt the creeping fear of a trick, but a more powerful emotion was beginning to surface. The fear of a violent ending was now battling the rising tide of pure intellectual curiosity. When the new truck pulled away later that morning, carrying Hans toward the airfield detail, he was still a captive, but the true invisible fence, the propaganda-fueled cage around his mind, had developed its first tiny fracture. The Arizona sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the flat ochre earth. When Hans stepped out of the truck, he felt the vast, empty heat. He realized the true scale of his imprisonment was not the fence around the camp, but the sheer, silent space of the continent itself. The air was thin and clean, a stark contrast to the sulphurous clouds of conflict he had known. Hans had expected desperate chaos. Instead, he found order dictated by the precise, if somewhat detached, letter of the Geneva Conventions. The barracks were Spartan but clean. The food, though simple, was adequate and hot. The daily caloric intake was standardized at 3,200 calories. This abundance was not a gift of mercy, but cold, efficient logistics. A well-fed prisoner was a compliant and productive worker. What confused Hans most was the demeanor of the guards. They did not shout or threaten. They spoke in a slow, casual drawl, addressing the prisoners with a kind of weary professionalism. Authority was wielded without malice. This was the first soft evidence that the American monster was bound by internal constraints the Reich had never understood. The work detail at the nearby Army airfield focused on maintaining roads and organizing storage depots. Here, outside the wire, the propaganda began to truly unravel. The guards treated the prisoners more like temporary, annoying colleagues. Hans was assigned to a crew repairing a dusty road bordering a working-class town. He saw ordinary, everyday Americans, women in floral dresses, children riding bicycles. They looked tired, certainly, but free. There was no nationalistic fury. It was in this detail that Hans first encountered Cal, a lanky guard with a perpetually tilted cap and a manner so relaxed it bordered on indifference. Cal often watched Hans with vague curiosity. Cal was friendly, using simple English words. He talked about farming and weather, and once he offered Hans a small, round piece of chewing gum with a casualness that was profoundly disorienting. Hans accepted, still waiting for the catch. But the catch never came. The lack of fear was the most potent weapon. The Americans were so confident they did not need to crush the enemy's spirit. The truth of America, he realized, was a bewildering display of functional decency. But he still needed proof of the political rot. He needed to find the source of their weakness. He desperately searched for the chaos that had been promised by the radio broadcasts back home. The American sun, relentless and indifferent, hammered down on the tarmac. For Hans, the hours spent shoveling gravel and sweeping dust were a quiet form of purgatory. The work was simple. The guards, quiet, and the only break was the occasional roar of an American bomber. One afternoon, as Hans systematically scraped a pile of wind-blown debris near the perimeter, a sudden sharp gust of wind swept across the field. It lifted a cloud of grit and detritus, carrying it toward the prisoners' work area. Among the scattering detritus, something white and folded tumbled to a stop near Hans's boot. It was a newspaper, a single, lost sheet. The discovery felt like an immense, forbidden opportunity. Instinctual fear seized him. Possessing foreign news was severely punished at home. He glanced up quickly, heart hammering. Cal was 50 feet away, leaning against a pickup truck, calmly chewing his gum. He had noticed nothing. In one quick motion, Hans stooped and folded the brittle, ink-smudged paper into a tight square. He slipped it inside the waistband of his uniform. He carried the paper like a live coal, every moment spent waiting for discovery. The coarse, cheap quality of the paper felt alien and unsettling against his skin. Back in the barracks that evening, Hans waited until his comrades were lost in fatigue. He unfolded the paper slowly under the faint light. It was a partial front page of a local Arizona paper, perhaps 3 days of age. The headlines were in English, a language Hans could decipher enough to understand the gist of the words. He scanned the headlines, seeing notices for war bonds and local baseball. Then his eyes fixed on a bold central headline above a political cartoon. The cartoon clearly depicted President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Below the drawing, the accompanying editorial was a vicious, scathing critique. It accused Roosevelt of being out of touch, of overreaching his constitutional authority. Hans read and reread the key phrases, translating the most potent insults in his mind. Lying, incompetent, dictatorial methods. His mind screamed in silence. This was open political treason. In the Reich, such a document would not only condemn the editor to prison, but would likely lead to the elimination of the printing house. The idea that a private citizen could publish such fury against the nation's leader and still be free was beyond comprehension. This breach of loyalty was the most dangerous threat to his entire worldview. Hans stared at the paper until the lights went out. He knew now that he had to learn the truth about this terrifying, impossible freedom. The newspaper was a bomb hidden beneath the foundation of his entire worldview, and he had just lit the fuse. In the near-total darkness of the barracks, illuminated only by a hesitant sliver of moonlight filtering through a high window, Hans held the scrap of paper as if it were a coded message from another universe. The silence around him was heavy, but inside his own skull the clamor of confusion was deafening. He had found the weakness, the rot, the chaos promised by the Reich, manifested as freedom of speech. The words were an open declaration of war against the executive office. The editorial did not merely disagree with President Roosevelt, it impugned his intelligence and questioned his legitimacy. Hans, raised in a system where the leader's word was national honor, felt a terrifying sense of instability. He had been taught that the state must be monolithic and unchallenged to survive. He kept expecting a censored mark, or signs of the secret police. He knew in the Reich this level of dissent meant severe punishment. He realized the true subtle cruelty was what was happening to his reality. If the Americans were so weak, so divided as to allow this open attack, why did their war machine function so efficiently? Why were their prisoner of war camps so orderly? The logic that held his world together, that strength was born of enforced silence, was being dismantled by this paper. The American system, by allowing its citizens to air their grievances so openly, appeared not weaker, but strangely resilient, like a mighty tree that allows the wind to bend its branches without breaking its trunk. The lack of fear associated with this criticism was a truly profound shock. Hans carefully folded the paper again. He was no longer afraid of the American guards. He was afraid of the profound, terrifying truth contained in that newspaper. He was afraid that everything he had risked his life for was built on lies about the true nature of power. The paper was a seed of doubt planted in the most fertile soil of all. He had to know if the criticism was a rare outburst or the accepted reality. The political freedom seemed far more powerful than any weapon they possessed. The first rays of sunlight pulled Hans Richter from a restless sleep. His immediate thought was that the authorities would come today, and the severe retribution would be delivered. He rose with a heightened sense of alert, monitoring the movements of the guards. Nothing was different. The world had not plunged into chaos overnight. The sun still rose. The food was still served. The nation whose leader was being publicly savaged still functioned with quiet efficiency. The criticism did not make the system flinch. Throughout the monotonous workday, Hans found himself in a state of hyper-observation. He realized the core difference between the system he had served and the one that now held him captive. In Germany, the regime demanded unquestioning belief for the leader, knowing that public doubt could shatter the fragile facade of its authority. Here, the system appeared utterly secure. It allowed the criticism to rage openly, confident that the foundation of the state was stronger than any single editorial. This resilience was baffling in the face of such relentless public disagreement. Hans observed the entire ecosystem of legal dissent. He found letters to the editor, some defending the president, others condemning him with equal ferocity. He saw advertisements for rallies supporting the opposition party. This was not the chaotic collapse he had expected. This was a well-oiled machine of political argument. The true horror of the Nazi propaganda became clear through this moral contrast. The Reich had lied about the very nature of strength. It had claimed that dissent was weakness when, in fact, the American capacity to absorb and process furious public disagreement without internal strife was a profound source of strength. It suggested a political maturity incomprehensible to a man who had only ever known the iron fist of a dictatorship. He thought of the German officers who had always stressed that democracy was corrupt and inefficient. Yet here was the evidence: a nation at war, fighting on two fronts, maintaining its economy, feeding its prisoners, and simultaneously allowing its own citizens to call its leader a tyrant in print. The kindness was simply a byproduct of profound confidence. Hans knew he needed to understand the simple mechanism that allowed a man to tell his president he was wrong without facing severe repercussions. He realized the United States had a strong self-correcting mechanism built right into its culture. Hans's intellectual hunger turned his captivity into intense research. His focus shifted to finding more papers, examining every scrap of English print for context. He collected several fragments, all confirming the relentless criticism of President Roosevelt. He needed a translator who could convert meaning. He chose Cal, the lanky guard, precisely because Cal seemed so uncomplicated. One slow afternoon, while sorting supply boxes, Hans took a calculated risk. He retrieved a fragment showing a scathing cartoon and approached the guard, feigning confusion. "Cal?" Hans asked, pointing to the drawing, his German accent thick. "Why is this allowed? This drawing is very disrespectful. Doesn't the government punish the man who prints this?" Cal squinted at the paper, then shrugged, entirely unfazed. He reached into his pocket and offered Hans a piece of gum. "Shoot. They criticize him every day," Cal replied, slowly unwrapping the confection. "He's the president's son, not God. If he messes up the rationing, folks have a right to say so. That's what newspapers are for. The phrase struck Hans with the force of a physical blow. He's the president, not God. In Hans's former world, the leader stood above any such comparison. Cal's simple explanation dismantled the philosophical cornerstone of the totalitarian state. The guard didn't see the paper as a threat to authority. He saw it as an exercise of an innate right. Cal simply laughed when Hans asked if the editor would be arrested. Nah, the president's got to take it. We voted him in, we can vote him out. That editor, he's just keeping folks honest. Hans realized that in America, the ultimate power did not reside in the single office, but in the constant churning debate of the people. The criticism was not a symptom of weakness. It was the engine of accountability. The regime, he knew, suppressed criticism because it needed perfection to maintain its illusion. American democracy allowed criticism because it was built on the acceptance of human fallibility. Hans thanked Cal, his voice quiet, tucking the paper away. The guard had, with casual efficiency, given Hans the key to understanding his captivity. The United States was so secure in its principles that it could afford to let its enemies witness its domestic arguments. Hans knew that Cal had given him the greatest moral lesson of the entire war. The small guarded fire pit behind the barracks was the only place where the German prisoners felt they could speak with any measure of privacy after dark. The low crackle of the mesquite wood provided a comforting distraction. It was in this furtive sanctuary that Hans Richter decided to share the truth he had found. He steered the conversation gently, asking his comrades what they expected to find when they were released. The men repeated the familiar propaganda with tired certainty. America would descend into economic turmoil. Hans waited for the moment of highest certainty, then pulled the carefully preserved newspaper fragment from his uniform. He unfolded it slowly, presenting the cartoon and the brutal editorial. "Look at this," Hans said. "This is treason. This is the truth of the chaos we were promised." The reactions were immediate and divided. A corporal named Klaus, a devoted party member, snatched the paper. His face darkened with fury and pain. "This is a betrayal. It is a lie, staged by the Americans to demoralize us. If this is real, then everything we fought for, everything we were told was holy, was built on sand." Other comrades were deeply skeptical. Hans patiently explained his weeks of observation. He used the paper to argue that the Reich had fundamentally lied about the enemy's core strength. The idea that their sacrifice had been based on a catastrophic miscalculation was terrifying. Their initial anger was, Hans realized, a form of intellectual grief. The most profound realization was not about America, but about Germany. The constant need for unquestioning loyalty and the vicious suppression of dissent at home were proof of the Reich's deep, gnawing insecurity. A system that had to silence its own people to survive was inherently fragile. "They told us democracy was weak and corrupt," Hans concluded. "But what if this is their strength? What if the ability to publicly correct their leaders the reason their machine never breaks?" He felt the immense weight of the historical lie finally lifting. The argument hung in the cool desert air. The men could not dismiss the evidence. For the first time, Hans had not merely witnessed America. He had begun the difficult process of exporting its truth back to his own people. The intellectual wall that had once defined their nation was showing its first deep fractures, and the agent of its dismantling was a single, lost sheet of American newsprint. The air inside the barracks, stale with the scent of pine wood and old sweat, was charged. The newspaper fragments became the centerpiece of clandestine late-night seminars. The men debated the core difference between the two systems. In Germany, authority was demanded, protected by severe retribution. In America, authority was a temporary contract, renegotiated through public argument. Otto, the engineer, questioned how a nation could attack its leader and still win the war. Hans explained, "It is the difference between forced unity and earned trust. Their loyalty is earned by allowing them the dignity of disagreement. The criticism does not break the machine, it cleans it, forcing the government to be better." For Hans, this was a moment of profound personal healing. His mind was free again, He was practicing the skill that had been suppressed: open, reasoned inquiry. The paper had presented a lost philosophy of governance. They discussed the idea that the president, even in wartime, was constrained by the watchful eyes of every citizen, armed with a pencil and a newspaper subscription. Klaus, the party member, spoke finally, barely a whisper. "I saw men removed for less than what is printed here. If this is the normal way they live, then we truly misjudged their strength." The discussions gave these defeated men a new language for freedom. The greatest impact was not in changing their political allegiances, but in restoring their moral compasses. The American newspaper became a quiet antidote to the poison of propaganda they had carried. As Hans drifted to sleep, the memory of Cal's simple phrase echoed in his mind. "He's the president, not God." That single line, absorbed and debated under the Arizona stars, had done more to dismantle the foundations of his former beliefs than any Allied bomb ever could. He knew the lesson he had learned would be the most important cargo he carried back across the ocean. The news arrived with the solemn, lowered gaze of an American sergeant walking through the barracks. It was April, and the single heavy word was capitulation, surrender. For Hans, the news that Germany had yielded felt like the inevitable echo of a verdict already delivered months ago. There was no joy, only stunned silence and a profound collective grief for a lost war. In the days that followed, the camp's routine transformed into repatriation. Hans folded his meager belongings, his uniform, his worn dictionary, and the newspaper fragment. He folded the piece with the damning editorial into the deepest recess of his canvas sack. It was a relic, a secret compass pointing toward a future he barely dared to imagine. The farewell scene was muted. The American guards stood quietly by as the trucks arrived. The sense of mutual detachment remained, yet something profound had shifted. There was no bitterness, only a shared, weary acknowledgement of the war's conclusion. Hans approached Cal. "Thank you, Cal," Hans said, his English careful. "For the lessons," Cal smiled. "We fight for the right to complain, I guess. That's the whole point." Hans took his hand, a firm, rough handshake that represented the end of their strange captivity. The journey east showed Hans the efficient enemy machine. When the ship docked in Bremerhaven, the visual shock was immediate. It was a gray, biting day in early winter, the temperature a damp contrast to the dry, burning heat of Arizona. The docks were ruins. Buildings were skeletal frames, and the air was thick with the chilling odor of coal smoke and wet ash, a heavy atmosphere that seemed to crush the spirit. This was not a homecoming. It was an arrival at a profound national calamity. As Hans stepped onto the broken soil of his homeland, he saw the faces of the German civilians, hollow, quiet, and haunted by the silence of the centralized authority they had trusted. The propaganda of the Reich had promised them global dominance. Instead, it had delivered them to absolute ruin. In that moment, the contrast was absolute. In America, Hans had found a country strong enough to tolerate open political dissent. In Germany, he found a country demolished by its own refusal to tolerate the slightest whisper of critique. He had carried an idea across the Atlantic, a seed planted under the Arizona sun, but now he saw the barren soil into which it must be sown. The work ahead would be harder than any physical labor he had performed. Hans gripped the strap of his canvas sack, feeling the comforting, wrinkled presence of the newspaper scrap within. He knew his physical journey as a prisoner was over, but his greater journey, the intellectual work of building a future that valued honest argument over enforced silence, was just beginning in the vast, cold ruins before him. The rebuilding of Germany began not with shovels and mortar, but with the painful, difficult work of rebuilding the truth. In the shattered cities and towns of the defeated nation, a quiet war was being waged against the lies of the past, a war that required paper and ink, not bullets. Hans Richter, armed with a newfound pragmatic command of English and the profound lesson he had learned in the Arizona desert, found his purpose in the ruins. His intellectual background and his unique experience as a prisoner who had witnessed the functioning core of the American system made him invaluable to the Allied-sponsored efforts to establish a free, democratic German press. He started small, translating documents for the occupation forces, but quickly advanced to writing for one of the new struggling regional newspapers. He focused his energies on explaining the concept of accountability to a populace that had only ever known unquestioning belief. His articles did not preach democracy in abstract terms. They used concrete examples, often recalling the casual, almost insulting criticism directed at President Roosevelt. He wrote that the highest act of citizenship was not obedience, but informed, critical participation. The American capacity to self-critique, which the Reich had called a fatal weakness, Hans now presented as the essential ingredient of national strength. In the late 1940s, as the currency stabilized and the rubble slowly cleared, Hans became a respected, if sometimes provocative, voice in the nascent German Federal Republic. He focused on civic education, patiently explaining the mechanisms that prevented the return of authoritarian rule. He would often tell his colleagues, "The danger is not in the argument. The danger is in the silence." He saw his work as fighting the final ghosts of the totalitarian mindset. He understood that a free press was the only true guarantor of peace. Decades passed. The ruins were replaced by gleaming modern architecture. The Federal Republic of Germany took its place as a thriving democracy. Hans, now a dignified, gray-haired man, retired. One chilly afternoon in the 1970s, he read the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. The front page held a scathing political cartoon and a headline openly criticizing the current chancellor as an ineffective leader. Hans smiled. The system was absorbing the dissent and functioning. He walked to his study, where the original newspaper scrap from Arizona was framed. He stood looking at the contrast. Fear replaced by debate, absolute leadership replaced by accountable service. Hans passed away in the 1980s, a quiet pioneer. He was one of thousands of German prisoners who returned home with an unexpected education in the practicalities of freedom, becoming the first, most crucial ambassadors of reconciliation. The greatest victory in the war was not won on the battlefield, nor was it signed in a treaty. It was won in the mind of a single prisoner, taught by a simple guard and a lost newspaper that the true strength of a nation lies not in its ability to enforce silence, but in its profound, confident capacity to endure and thrive on the noise of honest argument. The seed of freedom planted in the arid Arizona soil had taken root, and its branches shaded the new Germany. What Hans Richter discovered was the true blueprint for freedom. If this profound story of courage and accountability changed your perspective, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next forgotten moment in history.